America never used to be that bothered by Formula One. Sure, nowadays fueled by a supersized order of drive burgers with a side of survive fries, American interest borderlines on obsession. F1 currently flies stateside for a Grand Prix thrice a year, and rumours regularly persist over other starred and striped venues becoming part of the calendar. And in 2026, America's largest automaker, General Motors, will be riding onto the F1 grid for the very first time. For a sport that has historically been predominantly Eurocentric with its calendar, fan base and teams, this explosion of US interest has been simply seismic. But it hasn't always been this way. When I first started watching F1 20 years ago, despite America's long-standing reputation as a gas-guzzling, sports-mad nation, their relationship to the sport was the same as my reaction to discovering that someone's brought Monopoly to games night. Indifferent at best. That was reflected in the jumbled journey of the US Grand Prix, which unlike long-established venues like Monza or Silverstone, never really settled in one location, finding itself shunted this way and that across the states, from Long Beach and Las Vegas to Detroit and Dallas. One of F1's more infamous rumours suggests that the 1989 edition in Phoenix had more spectators for some local ostrich racing than at the Grand Prix. Even a stop-off at the self-proclaimed racing capital of the world, Indianapolis, wasn't able to fully pique the average American's interest. As Murray Walker put it back in 2009, if the cars haven't got roofs, they're just not interested. America remained F1's awkward cousin. One needed to complete the World Championship family of F1, but one entirely uninterested in joining those family dinners, content to get on with their own thing in their bedroom. F1 needed America, a lot more than America needed F1. So what could entice America out of its room? If it had its own team and an international racing series with the worldwide importance of F1, Murray mused, it just might over time get enthusiastic about it. Even before we had our modern-day Haases and Cadillacs, the USA was no stranger to the team ownership game. Between 1960 and 1986, 7 American entries had arrived and exited not long after. The electric blue Scarabs had been the first, rocking up to the 1960 Monaco Grand Prix and proving frighteningly obsolete, with their front-engined cars 10 seconds off the pace of all others whose engines occupied the now traditional rear end. Not long after came the Scirocco, heavy, uncompetitive, and with the background drama of being funded by a millionaire's underage son who ran off home within a few months. Latter projects like Parnelli or Haas Lola came with substantially more promise, with each boasting the expertise of a legendary racer come team owner in Parnelli Jones and Carl Haas, and driving talents like Mario Andretti and Alan Jones, yet both producing only marginally better results than had come before, and bidding a hasty retreat from the sport within 18 months apiece. Those early examples perhaps suggest that America didn't have the faintest clue on how to run an F1 team, but such a notion would denigrate the success brought by several more successful ventures. Think of a successful American constructor and 2 names may swim to the front of any budding F1 historian's consciousness: Penske and Shadow. Roger Penske's eponymous outfit is the most successful in Indy 500 history, with 20 wins to their name, but before they were going very quickly in one circle, they were doing the same in other circles, namely F1. From 1974 to 1976, Penske climbed up the order with John Watson winning the 1976 Austrian Grand Prix. But at year's end, with his US racing exploits expanding fast, Penske withdrew to focus on matters stateside. Don Nichols's UOP-backed Shadow enjoyed a rise through the field too, and within 2 years of their debut, the DN5 of 1975 was proclaimed briefly the fastest thing around, with back-to-back poles at the start of the year, and Tom Price winning the non-championship race of champions in it. By 1977, Shadow were race winners too, but not long after, several key personnel jumped ship to start a new racing venture in Arrows, and by 1980, Shadow slunk into the darkness too. And of course, we would be remiss to ignore Dan Gurney's Eagle operation of the late 60s, which dovetailed campaigns in F1 and IndyCar simultaneously. Dan the man had won races for the likes of Porsche and Brabham, and fancied a crack at the team owner/lead driver game. By their second year, Gurney gave the Westlake-powered Bird a soaring victory at Spa, and nearly followed up with a second at the Nürburgring. But the car was as reliable as your nearest politician, and that helped fuel the argument for the team to redirect its focus to their American branch, which they did 12 months later. That Belgian win remains the only F1 win for a car built entirely in the US. Even despite the successes of those latter three, none of the 7 fully captured the attention of an American audience. They all may have had the stars and stripes proudly flying outside their garages, but look closer and you'll see those stars are perhaps closer to a series of asterisks. Take Haas Lola, which proudly proclaimed itself an American F1 super team, with backing from Ford and Beatrice Foods, but was one based in Berkshire, with a car designed by Englishman Ross Brawn and driven by an Australian and a Frenchman. The likes of Shadow or Penske, both of whom sprayed champagne at the tops of podiums in the 70s, could hardly boast a swathe of American talent as the reason for why those successes had come along, being built in Poole, designed by Brits like Tony Southgate, or driven by every nation bar America. Perhaps that seeming lack of national pride was a contributing factor to America's F1 indifference. But what if there was a new star-spangled outfit in town, one based in America, one designed, built and driven by Americans, built from the ground up, doing things the American way? Could that turn the knowing Yanks into yes, thanks? That was what the F1 project entitled US F1 was proudly boasting. But if you get your finest opera glasses out and survey the current field, you might notice the glaring absence of this stateside sensation. And that's because this American dream very quickly slipped into an American nightmare. Unbridled optimism and boasts of placing the cat among the pigeons resulted in nothing of the sort. Much less than stepping foot onto the podium, the US F1 project never even turned a wheel at a Grand Prix circuit. Welcome to a tale of over-optimism, mishandling and mistakes. Welcome to the tale of America's awful F1 attempt. This story has 2 figures at the centre of it, both of whom are integral to our narrative. The first is a man called Peter Windsor. The Australian journalist may be a more familiar name to most, having been an ever-present in the media for the best part of 50 years, writing, presenting and editing across a litany of magazines and channels. To add a further feather to his bow, he also found the time to diversify into management, working with Frank Williams on developing Williams' new Saudi sponsorship in the 80s, with that role eventually morphing into a role as team manager there via another management stint at Ferrari for a couple of years. It was whilst working at Williams in the late 80s that Windsor first bumped into our second main character, an American engineer called Ken Anderson. They had met at Williams' headquarters at a time when Anderson was working for Penske shock absorbers. Both would soon move on to new roles. Windsor would return to the media position for which he is so well known, and Anderson would make the step into F1, first as race engineer to Ligier's René Arnoux, then technical director for the same outfit before tackling a similar role at Onyx. Thereafter, he returned to the States, tackling the blooming IndyCar scene, amongst other projects. But the two kept in contact, and conversations turned into a what if. What if we started our own F1 team, mooted the duo. Fast forward to 2005. Now Anderson and Windsor had stopped pondering and started plotting. We took a clean sheet of paper and looked at the technology in America. Composites, machine parts, material research, CFD, IT and aerodynamics. We wondered if we could build a team there, recalls Windsor. Here perhaps is a key point in this whole saga. When we consider other awful F1 attempts from history, people may well gesticulate at cases such as that of MasterCard Lola, a panic-stricken rush job that was doomed to fail before even arriving at a racetrack. But here we have clear evidence that this was far from another Lola-esque job. Here was a project brimming with careful consideration and long-term planning, which makes the eventual disaster it would become all the more shocking. Those plans and plots amalgamated into a presentation. On the 12th of December 2008, shortly after a meeting of the FIA World Motorsport Council, that presentation was to be found clutched in the hands of Nick Craw, president of the Automobile Competition Committee for the United States. ACUS coordinated the FIA's motorsport activities within the USA, and here was a doozy of an American motorsport activity to get coordinated. Craw privately presented Anderson and Windsor's plans to F1 Supremo Bernie Ecclestone and FIA President Max Mosley, and the two were impressed. The presentation drew parallels with the US lunar program, with one quote claiming the components of modern F1 cars such as aerodynamics, composite materials and telemetry were all the proverbial offspring of Apollo 9. Within the conclusion could be found a sentence perhaps worthy of a Hollywood writer's room. Our quest to return America to F1 draws in part its inspiration from the anything is possible dream that was, and still is, more powerful than the Saturn V rockets that propelled them to the moon. A couple of months passed, and on the 24th of February 2009, the project entitled Team US F1 was launched on American channel Speed TV, a broadcast network disappointingly lacking in ex-Toro Rosso drivers or hardcore drugs. What it did have was Windsor waxing lyrical about the project. We're putting together a new team with a fresh approach, and we're trying to do something positive when most of the world is being negative. More details emerged about the outfit. Anderson would be the team principal, he'll look after the engineering side, and I'll concentrate on the sporting side, confirmed Windsor, whilst plans were announced to livestream activity from the factory 24/7. Most importantly, Windsor was keen to beat the drum that this was an all-American effort. The team would be based in Charlotte, North Carolina, would be emblazoned with American sponsors and driven by two young American drivers. When quizzed on whether this could be the key to unlocking the door to America's interest in F1, Windsor responded, "We can't rival NFL, baseball and basketball, but we can offer a platform where we can take America to F1 and compete on the global stage." With all that in mind, the team was quietly optimistic, if cautious, over the future. "Obviously, we want to be competitive in the shortest time frame we can," said Windsor. "In year one, we'll be a young team learning and proving we can build a car outside Europe, and then we'll grow from there. Both Ken and I want to win." To a casual observer, it seemed an out of the red, white and blue decision. After all, given this had been a dream for the duo for nearly 30 years, what had prompted throwing their Stetsons into the ring? It's not as if there hadn't been opportunities previously to join the F1 field. The formerly Jordan outfit had more for sale signs outside than an estate agent's back office. Minnow's Super Aguri had been ready and waiting for a buyer before collapsing the previous year, whilst at the time the Honda soon-to-be Brawn operation were desperately seeking a buyer of their own. Why not them? Well, the duo did consider moving the project forward a year and entered into discussions with Honda about using Super Aguri's engines after the backmarkers had dropped off the grid in May 2008, though stumbling blocks no doubt emerged when Honda began to consider their own future in the sport. Yet purchasing the future world champions entry was an opportunity that slipped by. "It never occurred to us," admits Windsor, "because we started playing this team 4 years ago." Such an admittance reinforced, for better or worse, that deep-seated determination to make this the all-American effort that was being touted. Well-established, well-experienced that Brawn base in Brackley might have been, but it was conspicuously not in America. You can imagine the same reasoning as why USF1 was never mentioned in connection to a Jordan, Midland or Spiker buyout. What really caught the pair's attention were 2 words, 3 syllables. Budget cap. Amidst the ongoing global financial crisis and with the likes of Honda, BMW and Toyota all about to pull out of F1 within the next 12 months, a proposal had been put forward by FIA President Mosley to protect F1 and its future. Teams could optionally work within a budget cap of €30 million, with greater technical and design freedom granted to those who chose to do so. As ideas go, it was about as well received as the 2019 film adaptation of Cats, with a majority of the sport's movers and shakers feeling this would only create a two-tier championship. In protest, 7 of the 10 teams, Ferrari, BMW Sauber, Toyota, Renault, Braun, Red Bull and Toro Rosso, declared they would be withdrawing from the 2010 championship, would go off to create their own racing series, presumably with both blackjack and hookers to boot. Concurrently, the FIA, needing a fallback in case they were unable to persuade those 7 back into the fold, promptly announced they would be opening the 2010 grid to 3 new teams, to which 15 prospective outfits registered their interest, amongst which was US F1. Amidst the dark clouds of the will they, won't they breakaway drama, from Windsor and Anderson's perspective, this was one of the best times to ever enter F1. With a budget cap in place, the prospect of not only starting an F1 team, but starting an immediately competitive one, was easier and more affordable than ever. And US F1 had every reason to be more optimistic than most over the contents of their piggy bank. In early 2009, Anderson and Windsor had moseyed about Silicon Valley cap in hand and found themselves attracting the attention of one Chad Hurley. The American businessman had co-founded YouTube in 2005 and sold it to Google a year later for a tasty $1.65 billion, promptly joining the Google board. Hurley liked the cut of US F1's jib, being particularly enthused by entering the high-tech world of F1 as a startup. He agreed to put forward $15 million, with a first payment of $2 million entering the US F1 bank accounts at the end of February. That's not a lot compared to the modern-day budget cap of $135 million, but Windsor was confident that it was all they needed. "I genuinely can't work out why F1 teams are spending so much money," he quipped. "If you need to cut in every area of operation in the team, then starting a team from zero gives you a better opportunity to do that." From the get-go, though, Hurley made it clear that his role was as investor, not sponsor, and had no access to the Scrooge McDuck vault of Google billions. If US F1 needed funding, it was up to them to get it. But Windsor was optimistic, citing the multitude of sponsors that could be found somewhere like NASCAR. It has a lot of cool brands like Kellogg's or the US Army that you never see in F1, because in NASCAR they get a much higher return on investment. The amount of money NASCAR teams ask from a sponsor is relatively small, but they get a lot of TV exposure for that price, and we would try and give that sponsor the same amount. He was also keen to point out the great chunk of American money that was circulating around F1 at the time, from sponsors like AT&T, Hilton, and Intel. By May, more of the prerequisites for a new team were getting checked off. Engines were secured from Cosworth, one of F1's most successful marques, returning to F1 after a few years away, and offering out nice and cheap V8s in line with the proposed budget cap. Gearboxes would be built by Weissman, who had previously pioneered the quick-shift system, and best of all, keys were obtained to what would become US F1 headquarters in Charlotte, North Carolina. The 39,000 square foot workshop had previously housed serial NASCAR winners Joe Gibbs Racing, and was in prime location for any budding motorsport enthusiast. 20 minutes down the road was the Windshear Wind Tunnel, one of very few full-scale rolling belt wind tunnels in the world, not to mention 3 other wind tunnels, 3 7-post rigs, and a host of specialist equipment within a 50-mile radius. Add to that a direct route to the Charlotte Douglas International Airport, to which Windsor claimed, "Flying cars across the Atlantic isn't that expensive relative to the cost of driving them all over Europe in trucks. We could even get the cars back to Charlotte after a race before most European teams have driven back to base." A month later, on the 12th of June, the FIA had whittled down the 15 prospective applicants to the 3 that had made the grade: Manor, Campos, and US F1. The team would officially be America's first constructor in over 30 years, and Windsor was suitably emotional at the occasion. "My hope is that we can do some good with our new team, that we can remember always to be grateful, and that above all we can open a few doors for those who might have otherwise found them shut." Within a fortnight, that cheery optimism began to sag, and the first wrinkle of problems began to crease across the forehead of US F1. Mosley did a swift U-turn on his budget cap notion, screwing up the proposal and lobbing it into an F1 marked bin alongside other concepts like third cars and consistent track limits. The cost of competitiveness went from a weekly shop at Lidl to one at Fortnum & Mason, and Messrs Windsor and Anderson were hastily patting their pockets in search of the cash to stump up these new builds. Though Hurley had paid them $2 million in February, 90% of that immediately yeeted back out of the bank account in order to provide a deposit to Cosworth, leaving the team running on nickels and cents until the next trigger for payments was reached, written acceptance of their entry by the FIA, which wouldn't come along until the end of July, when the 2010 F1 entry list was confirmed. Efforts to secure further sponsorship had proved a struggle too. The world was in the grips of the worst recession for 70 years, whilst the ongoing infighting and occasional sex scandal was turning F1 into as appealing a marketing opportunity as sponsoring the sequel to Mein Kampf. By October, a few more alarm bells were starting to go off. Though the FIA's Nick Craw and Tony Purnell had visited the factory, with a quote from Craw suggesting he was impressed at their progress with it all coming together very quickly, others were noticing some problems. Cosworth reported that USF1 had not requested crucial design information, such as mounting diagrams or operating temperature data, when all other new teams had done so. Fans queried why the USF1 site, rather than showcasing their boast of 24/7 factory video coverage, was only posting sporadic blogs and the odd interview, all sourced from other sites. A member of the media department reports their budget had been slashed from $168,000 to under $30,000. The USF1 video suite would soon rival Nico Hülkenberg's trophy cabinet for most useless home possession. And perhaps the biggest sign that things weren't going according to plan was when their first driver was announced. USF1 were keen not to just promote American technology, but American talent. Having USF1 based in Oxford with a couple of Brazilians just isn't going to fly, joked Anderson. Windsor even intimated at the launch that the driver selection process would be very American too, a reality TV programme. A wide variety of names were thrown out, with Windsor reading off a list of who he considered good American drivers: Jonathan Somerton, Charlie Kimball, AJ Allmendinger, Ryan Hunter-Reay, Colin Fleming, Jonathan Edwards, plus a new generation in Joseph Newgarden, Alex Rossi and Connor Daly, whilst the Lizard Queen herself, Danica Patrick, was regularly mentioned by other media sources. However, concerned parties were quick to gesture that none of those names were gracing fields anywhere close to F1, either on the wrong side of the pond in the US or circulating in feeder series lower than a Jamaican limbo stick. If USF1 were determined to stick on the all-American front in the cockpits, they'd be fielding two very inexperienced heads. But Windsor was happy to share a glass-half-full perspective on that front. If we go with an experienced driver, then he will be a quantum leap ahead of the team already. Every time we hit a stumbling block, the driver is going to get frustrated, and we won't grow at the same rate, he explained. If we start with two relatively young guys, then we'll grow at the same rate and pace. Very quickly, though, it seemed the American rookie concept was being backpedaled on. By July, it emerged that plans had now switched to having an experienced racer slot in alongside just one American rookie, as this would help its development phase. It was also confirmed at the similar time that the Pope is Catholic and Luxembourg is small. The veteran pairing of Pedro de la Rosa and Alex Wurz were hotly tipped as the favourites, with both entering discussions with the team. Either would have been a coup, though advanced in years, both possessed a wealth of knowledge from roles as test drivers from the likes of McLaren and Williams, and boasted a near 150 Grand Prix of combined experience. If they really want me, I would be interested in this task to build a new franchise from scratch, said Wurz. Still, the months ticked by and there was no word from USF1 over their drivers, other than a regular vehement assurance there would be at least one American there and absolutely no pay drivers, with Windsor admitting they'd been approached by at least two GP2 drivers with sponsorship value of over 3/4 of the team's budget, but had been turned down on the grounds of sticking to the team's principles. There was no reveal who that duo might have been or just who this mythical American driver might be, although an Autosport report suggested Formula Atlantic driver Somerton was a leading contender. The tale took another twist when in November it was announced someone had a deal in place with USF1, and in contrast to everything said before, it was someone with a very large sponsorship package, no experience, and a very un-American passport. That someone was Argentine Jose Maria Lopez. Though he'd formerly tested with the likes of Minardi and Renault, he'd endured a middling to average junior career and had spent the last couple of years racing touring cars in his homeland. To call it a left-field signing would be putting it lightly. Yet by January, with sufficient funds from the Argentine government, it was down in black and white. Lopez would be a US F1 driver. Naturally, there were a host of queries over Lopez which Windsor was a tad sensitive about. First up was the dusting off of the old reason as to why they should sign inexperienced drivers. As a new team, we can go for the less obvious choice. It's not going to help us as a startup operation if a driver's saying, well, this is how we did it at McLaren. He then attempted to compare the young Argentine to Fernando Alonso, when asked if Lopez was a driver with pedigree or simply a pay driver, stating, "Are you implying that a pedigree driver wouldn't be a pay driver? I gather Alonso's got a lot of pedigree and he also brings a lot of money into Ferrari." It was perhaps telling that of all of Lopez's achievements, the most notable thing worth mentioning, for Windsor at least, was his gathering of funds. Whether people approved or not, Lopez had the gig, and so attention turned to the second seat. But no further announcements came out. Other veteran names like Jacques Villeneuve were mooted, as were inexperienced candidates like Alex Rossi, or very left-field options like Sebastian Loeb. Though the combination of experienced head and young gun was a commonplace occurrence within F1, few placed much stock in US F1's potential driver pairing, with F1 Racing magazine delivering the withering line, "Lopez and Rossi lack experience, and De La Rose lacks youth." In the years since, it has emerged that another young non-American driver was signed, Britain's James Rossiter, formerly a Honda and Super Aguri tester, though this was never confirmed to the public. As became clear very soon, whoever's backside was in the US F1 was quite irrelevant to everything else going on. The biggest concern on everyone's mind was the conspicuous lack of any sort of US F1 car. In July, Anderson had claimed the chassis would be built in August, would be rolling on the ground in late September sans bodywork, with the gearbox added in October. In reality, as of December, none of that had happened, and doubts were growing as to whether any sort of F1 car would be rolling out of that factory. Chief of the naysayers was none other than Ecclestone, who told the Times that he didn't expect US F1 to be on the starting grid come March. The article was quickly refuted by Windsor, who insisted everything is going well and that we've just finished the chassis, but refused to elaborate on just when the first US F1 car would be breaking cover. Whilst Ecclestone's scepticism was understandable given the overwhelming lack of obvious progress from North Carolina, as Anderson said, "I can't see the NBA talking like that about basketball teams, and such public assumptions could hardly have helped entice sponsors, nor encourage the workforce." Still though, maybe more through saving face than any real concern, Ecclestone did make a conscious effort to assist the all-at-sea American entity. First was an effort to merge US F1 with the similarly struggling Campos outfit, who possessed about as much cash as a Williams F1 repairs department, but owned a considerable better amount of car-to-go racing, or at least a contract with chassis manufacturers Dallara. Not long after, similar talks were held with prospective entrants Stefan Grand Prix and owner Zoran Stefanovic. The Serbian outfit possessed two F1 cars, originally designed and built by Toyota before their withdrawal, but no entry onto the grid, while US F1 seemingly possessed the complete opposite. It seemed the easiest solution to both teams' woes, but stubbornly, proudly, or foolhardily, delete as applicable, Windsor and Anderson were less than agreeable on the prospect of giving up on their all-American F1 car, and neither mooted merger came to pass. Despite claims that the team had continued to work pretty much throughout the Christmas break, and that senior engineer Scott Bennett was claiming the new car was very innovative, by mid-January US F1 failed to make payroll. Windsor gathered the workforce to a staff meeting and proudly asked, "Who thinks we won't make it to Bahrain?" To his horror, the entire workforce stuck up their hands in unison, with one particularly vocal member proclaiming, "There's no fucking way." Supposedly, Anderson and Windsor promptly beat a hasty retreat out of the factory to a nearby Starbucks. Things got so desperate that by February, and with payroll again overdue by a fortnight, it was mooted the team were looking to skip right over the opening races and begin their campaign in earnest 2 months after that. In a perfect world, we can miss the first 4 races, and show up in Barcelona, said Anderson, a prospect that was swiftly shut down by the FIA a few days later, who insisted all outfits, regardless of stars and stripes on their car, must participate in every round of the World Championship. By the 17th, journalist Adam Cooper was reporting that a source close to the US F1 team has confirmed what we have all suspected for some time, namely that there is no money, the outfit is nowhere close to being ready for the start of the season, and that it has neither complete cars nor engines. To that end, Hurley sent a delegation, part of which contained he of the Fox Smash door infamy Gunter Steiner, over to Dallara to see if they could weasel the chassis intended for Campos into the hands of US F1. And they could not. A week later, the FIA sent lead official Charlie Whiting to the factory to check on the team's progress. He found the completed bottom half of one chassis, a few other assorted bits and pieces, and that was it. Supposedly even that half a chassis was far from promising, unable to accommodate a power steering system and designed around an outdated aluminium bulkhead. It was estimated they had completed less than 30% of the parts required in the 10 months they had occupied their factory. On the 2nd of March, Lotus and Virgin were up and running around circuits. Campos had completed crash testing. US F1 was sending their personnel on indefinite unpaid leave. The next day, the FIA released the 2010 entry lists, which was noticeably lacking US F1. 8 days later, cars arrived for scrutineering in Bahrain, and surprise, surprise, there was no US F1 there. Around 60 staff were now out of work and out of pocket, with missing wages and unpaid expenses. Suppliers and contractors were also left hasty IOUs, with reports suggesting US F1 debts were around $4 million. When asked why they stuck on board that sinking ship for so long, a team member responded, "We were desperate to prove that the US could do it, so we pushed to the bitter end." Several of the team banded together to form the Cypher Group, intending to use those few US F1 assets for their own go at an American team in 2011, but promptly admitted defeat within a couple of months, citing a distinct lack of budget to support their dream. On the 24th of June, the FIA World Motorsport Council fined the operation €309,000 and disqualified the outfit from ever entering any FIA-sanctioned championship. Windsor slunk off to return to the world of journalism and media, and Anderson to establish a company around race fans, which a quick Google will tell you is just about as thrilling as that sounds. Tellingly, in the variety of interviews and podcasts featuring either one of the duo in the 15 years since, there is little to no mention of US F1. From the American dream of anything is possible to the American nightmare of everything is impossible. How did it all go so wrong, and what or who is to blame? Perhaps the first thing to nip in the bud is that this isn't a tale of dodgy dealings. It can be easy to make that assumption when around £17 million went into the project and nothing came out. But as they say, when you make an assumption, you make an arse out of you and pachun. An ex-US F1 employee is quoted as saying, "We were told there was a budget for 3 years when there patently wasn't, but I think that was driven by desperation, not criminal intent." If anything, this tale is, in part, a reminder of just how expensive the world of F1 is. Windsor might have scoffed early on as to why F1 teams were spending so much money, but when one takes a look at some of the expenses incurred, these things do tend to spiral. Confirmed costs spent by US F1 were a £1.5 million deposit to Cosworth, and the same spent on some ex-BAR trailers. Thereafter you have a host of other expenses, hardware, machinery, technology, wages, relocation costs, not to mention so many other outgoings. Of course, part of those money troubles were related to issues outside their control. Top of that lamentable list was the bothersome ballad of the budget cap. The ongoing will it, won't it debate over its conclusion loomed over US F1, and partly explained just why things fell so far behind as they waited to witness just what parameters they could operate within. Its eventual removal had enormous consequences for not just US F1, but the other new entities who did make it to the start line of 2010. What was possible for those smaller outfits suddenly shifted, and what could have been a margin of a few tenths to the midfield instead stretched into a chasm, and one that remained impossible to cross as the price of competitiveness suddenly skyrocketed. And of the quarter of the new arrivals, USF1 was the only, quote, true start-up, manufacturing everything in-house. We're not jobbing our car out to Dallara or Nick Worth, scoffed Anderson. To the detriment of USF1, they would find that enticing sponsors and backers on board amidst a global recession, and with the likes of Eccleston regularly belittling them in the media, was a near impossible task. It is worth noting that Anderson has claimed a major sponsor dropped out at the last moment, who would have fronted at least $40 million worth of expenses. It's also worth noting that said major sponsor has never been made known, but presumably was really real and just does its business in Canada, so you wouldn't even know them. Anderson has deemed the whole thing a perfect storm of catastrophic events that lined up to scuttle the whole plan. But to step away from the world's tiniest violin concert for just a moment, we should point out that none of this should have mattered. Because as far back as May 2009, Anderson was asked how crucial the budget cap was to their project, to which he responded, "Not really, because we've been planning this for years and we were coming in anyway. We know what it costs to do. If this was a panto, now would be an apt time to scream, 'Oh no, you didn't.'" As the FIA put it shortly before banging the gavel on USF1's disqualification, the team, whilst well-intentioned, had displayed poor financial management and had underestimated the requirement to present an F1 car for the 2010 season in the time and with the financial resources available to them. It was wholly unacceptable that the FIA was presented with only 3 weeks' warning of the total non-appearance for the team at the Grand Prix in Bahrain and for the 2010 season, and WMSC members had real concerns about the impact on the championship, not least the deprivation of the opportunity for another team to provide 2 cars to run in the championship in 2010 instead of USF1. Poor mismanagement is the glaring damnation within that report, and that leads us neatly to our 2 main characters, Anderson and Windsor. Here were 2 protagonists who arguably underestimated the task before them. As Mosley said at the time, they didn't realise how difficult F1 is. They felt it would be pretty much like setting up a NASCAR team. That's not to belittle NASCAR, but technically, it's a different exercise. Part of that comes from an overestimation of their own abilities. It always tickled me to read that quote from Windsor around the duo's achievements coming into the sport. It reminded me of the Ninja Sex Party lyric, "You've got your career and I do stuff." Ken has won the Indy 500 kart championship, scored podiums in F1, and I've been with Williams and Ferrari when they've been successful. It was a tiniest sign of trouble, but it was there all right. It was perhaps the vaguest and most tenuous description of success. To some, it raised questions over the relevant skills that Anderson and Windsor possessed. There are plenty of dubious quotes that surfaced during the research for this video. I genuinely can't work out why F1 teams are spending so much money. Where's it all going? Charlotte has direct flights from Gatwick, Munich and Frankfurt, and flying across the Atlantic isn't that expensive. Even their boasts of being the only true startup, being the only newbie to manufacture their own chassis while others subcontracted theirs, showcases a recognition from other parties in building a base for the outfit, and a mishandling of the situation from this one. Indeed, it seemed the two viewed their efforts through nostalgia goggles, which was highly unhelpful. When Anderson was asked in February 2010 over concerns on how much of a rush job the car might be after several failed crash tests, it's going to be frantic getting the car ready in time, but in '89 at Ligier, it wasn't unusual for a team to show up at the first race having never run the car. I remember at Onyx, we push-started the car down the pit lane in Brazil because it had never run before. Imagine going to your boss with a genuine concern and being informed, it'll be okay, because 20 years ago it was like this. Such a misguided opinion can explain why the project failed to attract top-level F1 talent on either the management or driving front. Witness the picking of Jason Anderson as their technical director, a man with zero F1 knowledge and a CV that only boasted being the son of Ken. As team principal, the buck stops with Anderson, and a lot of criticism around the project's failure does centre around the American, more so than Windsor. Despite his partner boasting over his achievements, Anderson's CV was questionable at best, with his most recent racing accomplishments being the Falcon IndyCar chassis, which never raced, and a stillborn next-generation Champ Car project, both of which succeeded a short and fairly indifferent F1 career. We have spoken of his bizarre team choices, and those that did get through the door found a micromanaging boss, with one employee stating he had a need to be involved in everything, quote, from the size of friggin' bolts to the shape of rockers. With that in mind, is it any wonder so little work was actually done? The most erroneous aspect that either Anza or Windsor stuck to was that all-American attitude. On one hand, without it, there's every chance that the team would never have been accepted onto the grid, as it offered them a unique selling point and a real potential to tap into an otherwise disinterested American market. But on the other, it was an admirable yet misguided philosophy that only slowed things to a crawl and ignored progress for the sake of passports. Turning down opportunities to sell part of that American soul to merge with the likes of Campos or Stefan were the epitome of that mentality. It makes you ponder what could have been. Even if a zombie form US F1 effort had been dragged kicking and screaming onto the grid, it would have comfortably rivaled a MasterCard Lola or Life for most pathetic qualifying efforts. Put it this way, Campos arrived in Bahrain with no pre-season testing, with a car described by test driver Christian Klein as not F1 standard, closer to a rally car, and we're 10 seconds away from pole. One can only imagine the hodgepodge US F1s would have needed a calendar over a stopwatch on Saturday. More intriguing is what could have happened with this Stefan Grand Prix merger, as the Toyota designed and serviced cars would have presumably been light years ahead of anything those other outfits would offer up. Points and a place in the history books as the most competitive and successful of those new outfits would surely be a nailed-on guarantee. But resulting models without that expertise might well have prompted a slump to the back of the field a la Prost Grand Prix, another journey from competency to chaos. Whichever way you look at it, glass half full or glass half empty, when you reflect on how the surviving trio of new entries gradually fell off the back of the field, the only debate is whether US F1 would have been the first of those dominoes to fall. The real final question, I suppose, is not how many tenths, seconds or months the US F1 cars might have been from the front, but whether their presence would have kick-started this new wave American revolution we're all living in now. Based on the reaction of the time, it seems more than unlikely. F1 Racing magazine visited Charlotte in February 2010 and asked a selection of locals whether they'd even heard of US F1. Of the 50 people they asked, only 6 said yes. Why would I go out my way to follow something halfway across the world that's always on TV at weird times, asked one participant, when we have 36 races a year in our backyard? US F1 needed to be more than just present, more than just part of the furniture. They needed to be winners. As Anderson said at the time, the thing about America is we're only interested in something when we're involved. No one watched the Tour de France until we had someone good in it. Some hold a belief that US F1 or a similar model could have worked. Everything you need is here, but it would have to be conceived and managed correctly, said Gunther Steiner back in 2010. The notion of an American-centric operation planted a seed of inspiration into Steiner, and his own North American racing team concept would eventually bloom into what most will recognise nowadays as Haas. Are the efforts of Haas, by now a long-standing mainstay in F1, regularly dependable for point scoring and the odd moment of glory, a fair reflection on what US F1 could have been? Perhaps. As Mosley reflected, I'd like to think they'd be back because we need an American team, but they'd have to make 1 or 2 changes first. No prizes for guessing which 2 changes he might be referring to. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider pulling into the pit box of my channel, bolting on the tyres of hitting that subscribe button, and tearing off the fresh visor of hitting the like button. I've had word from the pit wall that it's the best strategy available for you.